Hey everybody, welcome to Raw TV. My name is Nadia Schultz.
And I'm Herman Gaines, and the title of this show is Cross the Line.
Right, and before we dive into the show, I wanted to share a Facebook post from one of my friends. He said in his post, "I wish that everyone wishing ill against refugees and immigrants would have to swap places with them." And you know, that's a really profound statement to make, especially when Facebook political posts can cause more dissension than conversation. But I think it's something that we really need to take into consideration for tonight's show, because we are talking about immigration and what's going on at our borders during this time.
Yeah, so with that, we also are going to deal with how should Christians respond to the current issues as it pertains to immigration, and above all else, we're called to love. And a lot of times, like you said, given the rhetoric that's on whether it be secular media or what have you, that gets lost.
Right.
These are actual people we're talking about, not just, they're not all bad guys,
Right, but at the same time, we are also called to respect the authority that God has placed over us. And so we want to talk about what that line is and how we need to figure out how to work around it or work through it and work with those in this discussion. So before we get into that, stick with us and we'll be right back. Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are continuing our conversation on immigration and what it looks like to deal with this topic as Christians, being called to love everyone and also respect the authority that God has placed over us. So to start us off, I want to read from Romans 13, 1-2, and it says that everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. So what's interesting within the context of this verse is that it's kind of piggybacked by two verses about love. So the previous chapter talks about love, and the chapter after it talks about love. And so I think that really is poignant for our conversation, because yes, we are called to, like we said earlier, to love people always, and to also respect the position of authority that we have been placed in. So how does this verse affect your understanding of what it means to respect and also love people, respect authority and love the people that God has called us to?
Well, I think it definitely means, like, whoever is in government right now, God has allowed it to happen. He hasn't let anything happen without a reason. Everyone that's in government right now, every law that they're passing, it might not seem like it to us, but it is God willingly. He's letting it happen, and I think we just always need to trust in God. I think that's kind of what I get from Romans 3, like, God is putting everything in place, just trust in Him.
That's good.
I also see it kind of as, it's all in God's will. It wouldn't happen if it weren't in God's will. And, that doesn't always mean we agree with everything that happens. That doesn't always mean that everything that happens is for our benefit. But it is happening because God has allowed it to happen. And I have a verse here. It's 1 Peter 2, 13-17. I'll just sum it out. It says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, for this is the will of God, that by doing good, you will, show God's love." And I think that's something that is important, that even if we don't agree with what's going on, if we, burn down the streets, that's not demonstrating God's love. You can respectfully disagree. There's ways that you can, step up to the plate and, fight for what you believe is right. But
Sorry.
and you can do that through God.
I think there's like even examples when we look at like Esther and Mordecai who like rebelled against like the laws that their government had established or their kingdom had established, or even if we look at like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they didn't want to like bow down to the image that their king had set up, they were rebelling against what the government had in place. But at the end of the day, God was still glorified, and Jesus
Absolutely.
came through. Like, so
Yeah, I would actually want to take a different approach at that verse from the standpoint of like you said, Nadia, about love and how, given the context of the verse, is predicated around love. I think there are times where, like, as Christians, like, we are called to submit to the governing authorities, but when those authorities clearly contradict, like, our Christian values, then I believe we have to take a stand. And I think we see that also in the scripture in the New Testament, specifically within, like, the book of Acts. You know, like, they told them not to preach Jesus. And we know that Jesus is the best thing, right? As Christians, like, everybody needs to know about Jesus, you know?
Amen.
So the thing about it is that they had this reconciling moment as believers by saying, hey, you know, we get that the government is saying, no, we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't preach this. But I mean, who are we to, who should we rather give an account to the government or to God? And I feel like there are times where, as Christians, we have to be able to, yes, submit to the government, but do it in the context of when they're submitting righteously, you know, when they're doing the right thing. And so as it pertains to love and things of that nature, I think it should be looked at from the context of loving Christ, like the love of Christ, as opposed to it just being an unconditional allegiance to what you say. Because, I mean, that's how, you know, Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler's and people like that rise up, and they are able to cause I mean, just terrible damage to society as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point to bring up. The fact that respecting authority that God has placed does not automatically mean agreeing with everything that the authority has been put in place. So as college students, it sometimes feels like we may not have kind of the ability or the voice to be able to speak on these topics, right? And like that's why we have this show to continue that conversation for us college students. But what are some ways that you guys have found to kind of incorporate your voice into the conversation without, like you said, disrespecting authority?
For me personally, I have a YouTube channel called Chit Chats the Charity, and I talk about like these situations where it seems very controversial. But one thing that I like to offer on my show, like I have a video coming out called Dear Americans from a Christian's perspective. And I'm like calling out a lot of touchy things, but I'm also like leaving in links for you to go and do your own research. Because I could say how I feel all day long, but that's just how I feel. I want you to also take what I'm saying, the facts, and not just the opinions, and then go and do your own research. Because what better way to serve the nation that we're living in than to like become educated about the nation we're living in. So I think by us learning more about what's going on and not being afraid to voice our opinions is a good way, like a good step to take.
And also, like, for me, building off of that, you know, do your own research and go vote. You know,
Yeah.
I think that's not only our civil duty, but I think that's a way that we can really, you know, install our beliefs into our government. You know, we do have a say. That's the great thing about living in America. We have a say. Even though you feel like sometimes it might not be that much of a say, it does matter.
Right.
You know, there's other people that think the same way as you and maybe have done the same research as you. And that's the way that, for me at least, I feel like that's the way I can benefit whatever cause that I'm passionate about the most, is by putting, you know, voting that way.
And then like on a daily basis, just have like normal conversation with your friend, like, hey, what do you think about this? That way you get a real feel of everyone else's opinion besides not just yours.
I think that's a really important point to make, that within these conversations, especially when feelings can run high, one of the things to remember is to listen first. Not always are these conversations meant for making your voice heard, but also just understanding where somebody else is coming from. Which I hope is something that we get to show everyone. But Melanie, actually, you have a pretty personal like relationship with this topic. So why don't you share a little bit of your story as well?
So my parents actually immigrated over here, not the correct way to say, I guess, with my brothers with they were little, and my now co-pastor, they came here from Guatemala, and it wasn't a situation where they were fleeing because they were in drugs and violence and like all of that. They were just coming here for a better life. They just wanted to know that we weren't just gonna become strawberry pickers, and not offending anybody, but I mean, I come from that, so, you know, I'm not gonna become a worker in like the tortilla factory and make tortillas my whole life and just become a mother, you know, to raise kids, but actually be a person who can be a construction worker or be anything that I want to be, because it's the ability is right there at our hands. So that is why they came over here. But through that, it's not just me going to like a trip to the bathroom. It's so simple, but it was actually very struggling for them, and it really tested their faith, because you're walking in an unforeign land, not knowing what's out there, not knowing, you're kind of walking like with a blindfold on. You don't know if someone's gonna shoot at you, you don't know if an animal's gonna come out when you're sleeping on the ground at night, you don't know if something's gonna bite you, you don't know, you don't have any supplies to treat if you die or if anything happens, you don't have anything. Water limit is very low. My parents used to stop drinking water. There was a point where they stopped drinking water so that my brothers could drink water.
Wow.
And then they stopped, any food was only go to my brothers, as well as our co-pastor would stop drinking his water with his friend as well, so that they could give it to my brothers. So it was a lot of sacrifice, a lot of humbleness, but truly their faith was tested when they walked through the desert, literally.
Yeah.
So
That's
I
crazy.
believe that your story is incredible because it can like speak to so many people, especially that want to do things the right way, you know, come to the country and make a better life for themselves. But I can't help but imagine that even as you were sharing that story, there's somebody that may be watching. And they're like, see, that's the problem right there.
Right.
The illegally coming to the country, you know, illegal immigration, which is like the biggest thing with this topic. And so with that being said, what is the line as far as it pertains to like even governmental laws and things of that nature? What is the line between like respecting people who want to have a better life, but then also making sure we are protecting the country from, you know, bad people coming and doing things that are not good?
Right. I was talking to a lot of like military people and my family as well, and like the church as well, and I was like, you know, are we really disobeying? And I talked to my mom. She was like, to be honest, we actually are disobeying the law, because, and we can see it, I can also see it in the perspective of a military person who's saying, well, you know, the Trump and the president and every other person before that, they're just trying to protect the country. They're just trying to protect the people that are here to make sure that nothing bad comes over. And I can see their point of view, but at the same time, like you were saying, I wish someone can be in those shoes. You know, what would you do if, you know, all you see for your kids is just a terrible life, to be like honestly, that you don't want them to live for? You're gonna want to do the best for them.
Right,
Yeah.
which I think is something that we definitely need to continue talking about as it pertains to the church in our discussion in our next panel. So thank you guys, and stick with us. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Shanti, and I am from the beautiful island of Dominica. I moved to the States about 6 years ago, and in 2016, God began to do some things in my life, and I decided to go to Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida. I am a music major, and my goal is to get into worship ministries and eventually do some of my own music. Recently, I became a U.S. citizen, and usually a lot of people have difficulties getting U.S. citizenship. The process is kind of long, but mine was really short, literally really short, about 4 months. I submitted my application in January, and we're in April, and I'm about to be sworn in as an official U.S. citizen. God has been really faithful throughout the entire process, and this process in itself is a miracle and a testament of God's favor and God's faithfulness.
Thank you for joining us again as we continue our discussion on immigration. And we're actually joined by Professor Yoon Shin.
Thank you.
You're a professor of theology here. And from what we know of your story, you're actually an immigrant
I am,
from
yeah.
Korea?
Yes.
Yes, sir, Korea. And with that being said, we know that you immigrated here at like a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
So would you mind just telling us a little bit what that experience was like from your
Yeah.
perspective?
So just a little background. I was born in South Korea, and we immigrated right before I turned 9. This was, I think it was February 1st, 1991 when we moved. Yeah, it's kind of seared in my mind. I didn't want to move. As a little kid, I was like, this is home.
Yeah.
You know. you know, but growing up, I heard after I grew up, you know, I started hearing the stories of why we immigrated. It was, you know, we were kind of lower middle class, kind of poor, and apparently there were some financial struggles that we, as not just my own immediate family, but extended family, we were going through. And some of my aunts and uncles had already immigrated to New Jersey, and so they were trying to get everyone over for a better life, right? That's the immigrant story. So yeah, that's what happened. We moved. My family immigrated to Jersey. We were there for about 9 months until my parents found a business opportunity, a grocery store in Tampa. We didn't know anybody in Florida, but you know, we packed up the vehicle and we moved down. And I grew up in Brandon, 45 minutes from here in Lakeland. You know, I graduated from a school in Hillsborough County, and yeah, so here I am.
Right, and so obviously you have lived here for a lot longer than you lived in South Korea.
Yeah.
So what has adapting to that culture looked like for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I, as an immigrant in the Korean community, they call me the type of people like me who immigrated a 1.5. So we're not a 1, right? We're not just in Korea. We're not a 2. We're not born here. We're 1.5. We're kind of hybrid. So I'm what's called a third culture kid, as in I don't really have a culture. I don't have one culture to identify with. I'm not fully Korean, even though I grew up there. I've lived here most of my life. But because of those formative experiences I've had growing up in Korea and growing up in a Korean household, I'm not fully American either. And this really hit me when I went to Korea to teach English for a year after college. There I looked Korean, I could speak some Korean, and so they expected me to act Korean and know how a Korean would move and behave and talk and whatnot. But because I didn't, I think I disappointed some. I probably broke some cultural taboos, whatnot. But you know, it's funny when I'm here. Right, I'm not fully American, right? I eat smelly food. I have different ethos, different cultural values and whatnot. And so it's you know, I think for an immigrant who's kind of had some formative years in both cultures or different areas, one takes on a hybrid identity, a hybrid culture, and it's one becomes very adept at being a chameleon. My wife, who's also a missionary kid from the Philippines, we briefly led a group called Mukapa, which was a student club for missionary kids. And something that we've learned about missionary kids as well, because they're also third culture, who are often American, but they don't really know anything about America. They don't know anything about American pop culture or whatnot, right? Third culture kids tend to learn how to adapt well, right? They're the cultural chameleon. And so the immigrant experience is like that as well. You learn to adapt. And the part of the strength of a third culture person, an immigrant, whatnot, is the ability to navigate through the maze, the cultural maze, the moral maze, right? And in that sense, I think immigrants can provide a great benefit to society, being able to play that middle ground, being able to show that different perspective that can benefit society, you know, in a positive way.
Right, and so with those kind of benefits of being a chameleon, there also comes people who kind of look down on immigrants and who do not see it in a favorable light. So what would you say? Would you say that there's a stigma for immigrants?
Yeah, you know, it's difficult to make general statements. Are there people who look down upon immigrants? Yes, I think so.
Right.
But is that a dominant group? I don't know, and I don't think so. Now, I'm not a sociologist. I haven't done an empirical study on it. I haven't even researched it. It's just not my area.
Right.
So now, of course, the dominant narratives certain narratives can be driven, right, and which could lead a minority view to gain a greater prominence than it really is. And so, could there be a portrayal of a heightened sense of some kind of xenophobia? Perhaps. If so, in my mind, and kind of an uneducated guess, I feel like that's not the narrative that we ought to buy into. You know.
Even like piggybacking off of that, I went to a high school where there, like my graduating class was almost 700 people. To some, that's a lot. To others, that's like, oh, that's not enough. But like the whole, like from the valedictorian up until like the 10th student in the class, they were all either like first generation like U.S. citizens or like their family had immigrated to America within some time of their life. And it was like crazy to see, like even my valedictorian who was from Columbia, he's the first student to graduate from my high school and go on to an Ivy League school, like Ivy League university.
That's amazing.
And so like I would think if anybody's working hard, it was those students who were not American. They weren't born on American soil, but they were working harder than some of us who were. So like, yeah.
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking on that too, regarding benefits. So, I think empirically this has been documented that the American church is either stagnating for some denominations, and other denominations, they're dying, right? Especially mainline denominations, they're dying. Evangelical, non-denominational Pentecostal churches, they're either declining or they've plateaued, right? So there's a very interesting book called The Next Christendom. Now it's a little bit outdated now, but by a guy named Philip Jenkins. And now, acknowledging that predicting the future is always very difficult, true.
Right.
But he says that if you kind of follow the trend, he says that out of all Western countries, in the next 50 years, I guess maybe more like next 35 or 40 years now, since the book came out, he thinks that if trends hold, America would be the only Western country that would have an increasing population of Christians in the West. Okay, so right, that would be a good thing. Like we're, as Christians, we would say that that's a good thing, especially with the fact that churches are either stagnating or dying. But here's the interesting thing: he says that this trend will hold only through immigrants.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. Because a lot of the people who are immigrating are from the global South, where there's a lot of Pentecostals, evangelicals, or Catholics, right? So it's not like so in some sense, by having a very strict immigration policy, we could be damaging our Christian identity, Christian culture, right? So we argue, we want to have a Christian culture and whatnot, but perhaps by having a strict immigration policy, we could be going against what we want.
Yeah, we don't want it's kind of like being Christian but not wanting the hard work out of it. We want that church, but we don't want the hard work out of it and the sacrifices it causes.
Yeah, so continuing on that same line, how do you feel the church as a whole right now, or even just different pockets of the church, are handling the immigration issue that we are currently facing?
Yeah, so once again, it's hard to speak about the church in general. I see certain churches, denominations working more favorably toward immigrations, even with illegal immigrants and whatnot, and certain other churches or denominations being a bit more hesitant or being outright outspoken against it, right? I think perhaps a better question is now trying to understand how the church in general may be responding. I think maybe a better question to ask is whether the churches that are in our context are how are they responding to it? Are they responding positively or negatively, and why? I think. One of the questions that I was listening to at the first panel was, I think, how college students can be involved, right? Perhaps it's difficult to get mobilized at a national level. Although I think these days with younger generation, their use of technology and whatnot, right, social media.
It's easier than ever.
It is, yeah. But it's also, I would say, even easier to start a grassroots effort at the local church. So I would say maybe perhaps a better perspective to take on isn't focusing what the general church is doing, but asking what's going on at the local church and what can I do here, right? We can even ask, is my local church even talking about this?
Right.
Yeah. What do the church community believe about it? Is there a split? Is this a contentious topic? Right. And I would challenge churches to talk about it. If it's not being talked about, I want to ask why. It's a very important topic.
Right. And I feel like even in
sorry.
But I feel like even in that, like you get to know what you don't know, because I can only know so much. But like coming from your background, when you were saying that, like, oh, you feel like you don't fit in with America, but then when you speak to like your Korean friends, it's like you don't fit in there. Like I wouldn't have known that. And even me as an African American, I don't know nobody that lives in Africa. And like, I went there on a mission trip, completely different culture. They thought I spoke their language and I didn't. And so it's just like different things like that you wouldn't know until you have a conversation. And stuff like you said, starting those conversations and like letting it flow, learning new things.
And staring a little bit off away from that. I actually when I was younger, I went to Calvary Church in Orlando, and it was a very huge church, kind of like Victory Church. It was a very huge church, but every person that would want to teach, be a deacon, be a co-pastor, sing, anything, they would interview them. They would go through their whole life story and want to know, what are you going to benefit from us? Like, what are you doing here? What's your story? How can we help? And I would love the pastor because my parents actually wanted to work for them. They wanted to become ushers. And he said, I'm not just gonna hire you, but I'm gonna help you. Like, I'm gonna help you through all your struggles. If something comes at your door, call me, I'm there. I have connections as well. So and then that was that church. And then when I came down to a church here, a Pentecostal little local church, they accepted my family and me as well. They were like, we're gonna help you as well. You know, if you ever need anything, just hit us up and call, and we'll be there at your door as well, or we'll give you shelter if anything happens. So I think that is very important because local churches play a huge role in people's lives.
Right, and I think something to remember is that it's never one side or the other. Like, we can't make blanket statements about general churches, right? There are churches like the church in Massachusetts that make very political standpoints. They said that for their nativity scene, they put baby Jesus in bars to kind of represent what was going on at the border. And they put the wise men behind a wall. And people gave them a lot of bad opinions about it and said that that's not what a church should be doing. But like we said, like, that's part of the conversation. If you don't know what's going on and how certain churches are handling it, then we can't learn and grow from each other. So that's definitely something we want to keep in mind as we continue this conversation. But thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. We have loved talking about this. And if you want to continue the conversation, we would love to do that as well. So we're going to go ahead and pray and close out the show. God, thank you so much for creating us in your image and for calling us to love each other. God, I just pray that we would just model your love for these situations, God, that your love would just shine through, that even when we don't understand or we don't agree with the authority that you have placed over us, God, that we would just continue to pray for and respect that authority, whether it be our pastors or teachers or our government authorities, God, that you have placed them there for a reason and you are ultimately in charge of it all, God. So we thank you for that, and we just pray that we would be your light in all of these situations. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation. But until next episode, don't forget to
Live it raw.